10 worst states to be in when the U.S. is attacked. Listen up. This isn't just another what-if scenario. These are real vulnerabilities, real consequences, and real threats that could turn your life upside down. You might think your state is well prepared or too insignificant to be a target, but let me tell you, when the U.S. is under attack, be it a physical assault, a cyber strike, or a coordinated economic takedown, some states will crumble faster than others. Supply lines will be cut, infrastructure will collapse, and everyday necessities like food, water, and medical care will become scarce in a heartbeat. We're taking a deep dive into the 10 worst states to be in when it all hits the fan. Not just for their obvious vulnerabilities, like massive populations and strategic targets, but also for overlooked cracks in the foundation, dependence on imported resources, fragile water systems, and critical energy choke points. If you find yourself living in one of these states, you need to understand exactly how exposed you are so you can start making a plan now. This isn't a game. This is a matter of survival. Let's get into it. 1. California. California practically wears a target on its back. The state is brimming with high-value military and industrial targets. Naval bases in San Diego, the Port of Los Angeles, and Silicon Valley's tech nerve centers. If these assets go down, forget about maintaining a functional economy or even a coordinated defense. You lose pivotal supply and command posts, and the rest of the country feels that shockwave immediately. But the military and tech hubs aren't the only vulnerabilities. California's massive population is concentrated in urban jungles like Los Angeles and the Bay Area. These cities are not prepared for rapid evacuation or prolonged disruption. Picture highways jammed for miles, gas stations drained, panicked masses clamoring for limited shelter. The result? Riots, desperation, and a breakdown of public order. And let's get real about food. California isn't just feeding itself, it's the produce basket for the entire nation. If an attack cripples the state's agricultural networks, water deliveries, farm operations, distribution centers, then we're looking at a nationwide food crisis. But even within California, once supply lines are cut, the dense urban communities won't be able to rely on their neighboring farmlands for survival. Drought conditions could worsen, water treatment plants might fail, and suddenly that sun-soaked paradise becomes a sweltering wasteland where water is more valuable than gold. California's extended coastline adds yet another layer of risk. With so many ports, beaches, and coastal highways, it's exposed to naval threats, missile strikes, or even infiltration by smaller hostile groups. You lose control of these entry points, and the state becomes a free-for-all. The perceived golden lifestyle in California quickly turns into a chaotic struggle for essentials: gas, food, electricity, and, most importantly, safety. 2. New York. New York is an obvious bullseye, with New York City being the financial, cultural, and media epicenter of the United States. If the Big Apple is hit, the ripple effects are global. We're talking about the collapse of financial markets, Wall Street, a massive blow to the United Nations, headquartered there, and a destruction of major media outlets. The chaos that would ensue isn't just local, it's international. Population density is a killer here. Over 8 million people in NYC alone, stacked into high-rises, reliant on subways, cabs, and daily deliveries of food and goods. People joke about how quickly grocery shelves empty before a snowstorm. Imagine that panic multiplied exponentially when supplies can't be restocked at all. New York depends heavily on imports for almost everything, from fresh fruits and vegetables to meat and dairy. Once the supply chain halts, your average New Yorker has no backup plan. Rooftop gardens won't sustain millions. Infrastructure like bridges and tunnels are prime targets. Cut them off and you effectively trap people on an island with dwindling resources. Hospitals, law enforcement, fire departments, overwhelmed in a matter of hours. And let's not forget about nuclear facilities like Indian Point, just north of the city. Any incident there, whether sabotage or meltdown, would blanket the region in radioactive fallout. New York's an iconic state, but icons make the best targets. When the unimaginable happens, millions will be stranded without an exit. It's a brutal reality that New Yorkers need to face. The city that never sleeps could quickly become a nightmare of mass panic and resource scarcity. 3. Texas. Texas likes to tout its independent spirit, its oil reserves, and its larger-than-life reputation. Let's break down why that might be a huge liability under attack. First, Texas is home to key military bases, Fort Hood, Lackland Air Force Base, and more, making it a prime target. Cripple those and you disrupt vital training, logistics, and deployment operations nationwide. Next up, oil refineries. Texas runs some of the largest in the country, fueling not just cars but the entire national transport grid, planes, trains, commercial trucking. An effective strike here would send gas prices through the roof, triggering economic turmoil and immediate shortages. Daily life becomes a scramble for whatever's left at the pump. And don't forget agriculture. Texas is a heavyweight producer of cattle, cotton, and various crops. Wipe that out, and it's not just Texans going hungry, it's millions of Americans reliant on these commodities. Then there's the climate. Summer heat in Texas can be punishing. If the power grid fails, air conditioning and refrigeration disappear. Food spoils fast, and water consumption spikes just when clean water becomes scarce. Urban centers like Houston and Dallas complicate matters. These sprawling metros aren't set up for quick evacuation or resource distribution in a crisis. Imagine millions of cars stuck in gridlock on I-10 or I-45 in searing heat with no idea where to find the next available gallon of gas or bottle of water. Within days, this scenario turns from dire to deadly. Texas has the swagger, but swagger isn't enough to stave off chaos when energy, food, and water supplies vanish. Without a robust emergency plan, and let's be honest, few people have one, it's a powder keg waiting for a spark. 4. Florida. Florida might be a tourist dream, but it's a disaster zone in the making when things go south. The state is practically surrounded by water. Great for beach vacations, terrible for evacuation options. One major highway artery runs north-south along the peninsula, and if that's jammed or compromised, you can forget about getting out. Military-wise, Florida holds critical installations like MacDill Air Force Base, home to U.S. Central Command, and the U.S. Southern Command in Doral. Disrupt those, and you hamper America's reach into Latin America and the Middle East. That's not a local issue, that's a strategic blow with global implications. Then there's Florida's population density. Metro areas like Miami, Orlando, Tampa all rely on constant imports of food, fresh produce, and almost all necessities. The tourism industry alone sucks up massive resources daily. If an attack or crisis disrupts shipping lanes or ports like Port Miami or Port Everglades, the entire state starves in record time. Florida grows its fair share of citrus and sugarcane, but these can't feed millions. And let's be clear, those storied hurricanes have already shown us that Florida's emergency responses can be overwhelmed easily. Now imagine something worse than a hurricane, something that cripples infrastructure long-term. You'd see a meltdown of public services, overrun hospitals, and zero tourism dollars, and economic collapse on top of everything else. Water supply is no joke either. Aquifers are fragile, and any contamination event would force residents to rely on bottled water. Exactly what disappears first in any panic run on stores. In a hot, humid climate, dehydration and heat stroke become lethal issues within days if the power grid fails or if water resources are compromised. Florida is an international gateway, a keystone for global commerce through its ports and airports. Cut that gateway off, and you don't just isolate Florida, you cripple America's link to the Caribbean and beyond. Paradise can turn into pandemonium overnight. 5. Virginia. Virginia is the operational center of U.S. defense. You've got the Pentagon, the CIA, and a host of other agencies lurking around Northern Virginia. This state isn't just another patch of land, it's the brainstem for the country's military and intelligence operations. Attack that, and the U.S. is in serious trouble. Command structures break down, intelligence lapses, and any response to further threats could be hamstrung right from the start. But let's also look at Virginia's population centers, like the D.C. metro area, which spills heavily into northern Virginia. Traffic is already legendary for being horrific, so if an attack occurs, good luck moving anywhere at all. Evacuating millions from places like Arlington, Alexandria, and Fairfax in a crisis? Pure fantasy. Highways become parking lots, and panic sets in fast. Food security is another ticking bomb. Virginia has agricultural regions, but nowhere near enough to feed the dense urban population. Grocery chains depend on daily shipments, which can be cut in an instant if roads, rails, or distribution centers are attacked or disrupted. Nutritional deficits would kick in within days, especially for vulnerable populations. Water. While the state boasts rivers and reservoirs, the real issue is purification and distribution. Once those treatment plants are compromised, you're relying on bottled water or questionable sources, risking waterborne diseases. Military contractors also dot the state. Massive facilities for shipbuilding, aerospace, cybersecurity, you name it. Each facility is a high-profile target. Sabotaging these sites wouldn't just compromise local jobs, it would cripple the entire country's defense production and R&D pipeline. Don't underestimate the significance of that. Hit Virginia hard, and you're effectively ripping out the backbone of the U.S. defense grid. 6. Washington. Washington State is often seen as a bastion of innovation and tech prosperity, with Seattle serving as headquarters for giants like Amazon and Microsoft. That's exactly what makes it such a liability during an attack. Take down the cloud servers, data centers, and software infrastructure here, and you're plunging the whole country into a digital dark age. Online banking, e-commerce, government databases suddenly offline or compromised. Seattle's population is highly concentrated and heavily dependent on maritime and air imports for food and goods. While Washington does produce agriculture, apples, wheat, potatoes, most of that is exported or specialized, not necessarily funneled straight into feeding Seattle's urban sprawl. Once supply lines are interrupted, grocery stores would empty within hours. The mountainous terrain and limited transport routes mean that restocking isn't just challenging, it could be next to impossible if rail lines or highways are taken out. Now add water infrastructure to the mix. Yes, it rains a lot, but that doesn't mean instant access to clean drinking water. The distribution systems and treatment plants are vulnerable, and if contamination or cyber attacks hit those networks, you can bet that people will be left collecting and boiling rainwater, praying they don't contract waterborne diseases. We can't ignore Washington's military presence either. Bases like Joint Base Lewis McChord and Naval Base Kitsap house critical defense elements, including nuclear submarines. That's a big glowing bullseye if you're an adversary. One effective strike there and you're not just harming Washington, you're compromising national nuclear deterrence. The chaos that would unfold in nearby civilian populations would be immediate. Evacuation bottlenecks, panic buying, and potential fallout or contamination. People often romanticize Washington for its forests and rugged coastline as if they can just bug out. Good luck with that. If roads are blocked or if you don't know how to live off the land for real, the Pacific Northwest terrain becomes unforgiving fast. Meanwhile, the city dwellers, deeply reliant on modern comforts, would find themselves in a harsh reality with no electricity, no internet, and no easy way to replenish food supplies. 7. Hawaii. Hawaii might look like an isolated paradise, but it's isolation that makes it a nightmare scenario in a crisis. The islands are over 2,000 miles from the U.S. mainland. That's a huge logistical challenge under normal conditions. Cargo ships and planes deliver almost everything that residents use day to day, including 90% of the state's food. If those supply lines are cut due to an attack, on shipping routes or the airports, you're looking at a population that could face starvation in a matter of weeks. Local agriculture can't feed everyone. Yes, there's some tropical fruit, coffee, and smaller farms, but that won't sustain the entire population. Many islanders don't have more than a few days' worth of food stored at home. Water is another bomb waiting to go off. You might think an island surrounded by ocean has plenty to spare, but salt water isn't drinkable, and desalination plants require significant infrastructure. If power grids fail or if these plants are damaged, fresh water becomes a prized and limited commodity. Rainwater catchment systems can help, but only if you're prepared and only if the rainfall is enough to meet massive immediate needs. Hawaii's strategic position in the Pacific also makes it a military fortress for the U.S., housing Pearl Harbor, Hickam Air Force Base, and more. That's a double-edged sword. It's well defended, but it's also a top target. A significant strike on these bases doesn't just cripple Hawaii, it weakens America's entire posture in the Pacific region. And if that strike disables communications, the islands could be effectively cut off from mainland support for who knows how long. Tourism is Hawaii's lifeblood economically, but in a crisis, tourists will become an additional strain. Thousands of stranded people who have no local homes or resources. Hotels, grocery stores, restaurants, they'll all be scrambling for dwindling supplies. Tensions will rise and law enforcement simply won't be equipped to handle widespread panic on top of potential military engagement. Hawaii might be heaven on earth in peacetime, but in an all-out attack scenario, that paradise could devolve into a desperate struggle for survival. 8. Illinois. Illinois isn't just about Chicago. It's about massive highways, rail lines, and one of the busiest airports in the world, O'Hare International. This is a logistical artery pumping goods throughout the Midwest and beyond. Cut off Illinois and you disrupt a crucial flow of resources, everything from food to fuel to medical supplies, across state lines. Chicago is a sprawling metropolis with a population of nearly 3 million in the city proper and over 9 million in the metro area. That's huge. These people depend on daily deliveries of perishable and non-perishable items. Your average grocery store is restocked multiple times a week. If those trucks and trains stop coming, you've got a matter of days before the shelves are empty. We also have to factor in the brutal Midwest winters. If the power grid takes a hit, maybe from a cyber attack or physical sabotage, heating homes becomes a life and death issue. Natural gas pipelines and power plants in Illinois are high-value targets. Disrupt them, and you're leaving an entire region to freeze. That's a reality most people don't grasp until they're trapped in sub-zero temperatures without electricity or gas. Water infrastructure revolves around Lake Michigan and the Chicago River systems. While that may seem plentiful, treating and distributing that water relies heavily on power. No electricity, no pumps, no clean water, then the threat of contamination rises, whether intentional or collateral, turning that resource from a blessing to a lethal hazard. Illinois also hosts nuclear facilities like the Byron, Dresden, and Braidwood plants, any of which could become a catastrophic threat if compromised. A meltdown or targeted attack would render large swaths of land uninhabitable, forcing mass evacuations. Roads would clog instantly and Chicago's complex highway system would grind to a standstill. That's millions of panicked people with nowhere to run. Illinois might look stable on the surface, but it's a house of cards. When those supply lines, energy grids, and nuclear safeguards start collapsing, the entire Midwest trembles. 9. Georgia. Georgia is an often overlooked but critical piece of America's infrastructure puzzle. Atlanta is home to Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International, the busiest airport in the world, and a labyrinth of highways and rail lines crucial for distributing goods across the Southeast. Shut that down and you effectively paralyze regional and even national logistics. Metro Atlanta alone has over 6 million people, a dense, sprawling population center reliant on daily truck deliveries to keep grocery stores stocked. Think about that for a second. How long can 6 million people last without incoming food shipments? Not very. And while Georgia has a strong agriculture sector, peanuts, peaches, poultry, the bulk of that produce is shipped out of state or exported. It's not reserved for feeding millions of Georgians through a prolonged crisis. Water is also a looming threat. Metro Atlanta's water sources, including Lake Lanier and the Chattahoochee River, are already subject to ongoing disputes with neighboring states. In a severe crisis, if you can't treat or transport that water effectively, it won't matter how big the lake is. People in the city will find themselves in desperate need of clean, potable water. Georgia's scorching summers turn lethal quickly if the power grid fails. Air conditioning isn't a luxury here, it's almost a necessity when temperatures and humidity skyrocket. That means a spike in water usage just when water might be in short supply, and if hospitals lose power or resources, heat stroke cases will surge. On top of that, Georgia hosts critical military bases like Fort Benning and Fort Stewart. A strike on these installations means major disruptions to the Army's training and deployment capabilities. That's not just a Georgia problem, that's a national security crisis. And if Plant Vottle, one of the few nuclear power plant expansions in the country, becomes a target, you're looking at potential nuclear disaster in the heart of the Southeast. Georgia has that southern hospitality, but you can't charm your way out of an infrastructure shutdown, food shortage, or energy crisis. The state's strategic importance is exactly what makes it so vulnerable. Pennsylvania might not pop into everyone's head as a prime target, but it's a keystone state, literally. Its infrastructure connects the Northeast to the Midwest, with Philadelphia and Pittsburgh serving as massive population and industrial centers. Interrupt those logistics, and you're severing a major artery for transporting goods across the eastern half of the country. Philadelphia alone has more than 1.6 million people packed into a relatively small area. They rely heavily on imported food and daily deliveries to keep supermarkets stocked. Cut those deliveries off and shelves go empty in days. And once the city's residents realize the food isn't being replenished, panic sets in. It's the same story for Pittsburgh, a hub for steel and manufacturing that's vital for various industries. If roads and railways are compromised, raw materials and finished goods can't move. It's an economic chokehold. Water infrastructure is another big red flag. Cities in Pennsylvania primarily depend on surface water sources like rivers and reservoirs. If those treatment facilities lose power or get hit, you've got a toxic cocktail of disease waiting to happen, especially in older urban areas where the plumbing can be downright ancient. Hospitals become war zones, and limited resources make it impossible to treat everyone who needs help. Then there's the nuclear factor. Pennsylvania hosts several nuclear power plants such as Limerick, Beaver Valley, and Susquehanna. Any sabotage or meltdown situation creates a long-lasting hazard with radioactive contamination spreading through water tables and farmland. Evacuating millions of people quickly from a radiation zone is nearly impossible. Highways like the Pennsylvania Turnpike would become parking lots, stranding families who'd be exposed to the fallout. This is a nightmare scenario that most residents don't even want to think about, but ignoring it doesn't make it any less real. Energy-wise, Pennsylvania is one of the largest producers of natural gas through fracking in the Marcellus Shale. Disrupt that, and energy prices soar, not just locally but across multiple states that depend on that supply. Families might find themselves freezing in the winter or unable to cook if their gas supply is cut. Businesses and manufacturing could grind to a halt, triggering unemployment and social unrest. Pennsylvania is a linchpin for the entire East Coast. An attack here is like taking a sledgehammer to the backbone of America's infrastructure, energy, and logistics. It's a grim scenario, but being aware of it is the first step to prepping for any eventuality. That's it. The 10 worst states to be in when America comes under attack. Now, this isn't about scaring you into hiding under your bed or running for the hills. It's about awareness and action. Every single vulnerability we've talked about, food supply chains, water treatment, energy grids, nuclear plants, evacuation routes, can be shored up if you start preparing now. Ask yourself, do you have a reliable source of clean water if the taps go dry? Enough food to get you through a few weeks, maybe even longer, if trucks stop rolling into your local stores? A way to stay warm or cool without the power grid. A plan to contact or regroup with family if cellular networks fail. You can't rely on the government to bail you out. In the aftermath of a major attack, local, state, and federal agencies will be overwhelmed. You'll be lucky if you get any help within days, or even weeks. The truth is, in a crisis, you are your own first responder, So take this as your wake-up call. Start building a pantry of essentials, learn basic first aid, understand how to filter or purify water, and have a strategy for sheltering in place or evacuating if you really have to. Because when the unthinkable happens, the difference between those who make it and those who don't often comes down to preparation. That's not fear-mongering, it's reality. Will you be ready? Or will you be just another casualty of a system that collapses the moment it's put under real pressure? Don't wait. Don't gamble with your family's safety. Start taking steps now to secure your own future. Because the clock is ticking, and when it hits zero, the time to plan is over.